Module 2, History and Development of Philosophy. Unit 1, The Ancient Age of Philosophy, 1.0, Introduction. In this unit you will be introduced to the history and development of philosophy from the ancient age to the contemporary age. You will also read about the major preoccupations of some philosophers that were prominent in each of the stages of the development of philosophy. You need to know that these stages of development in philosophy are sometimes referred to as an age. So we shall be talking about the Pre-Socratic Age, the Medieval Age, Modern Age, and so on. 2.0. Intended Learning Outcomes. By the end of this unit, you will be able to discuss or write about the philosophical events of the Pre-Socratic Age, identify some of the philosophers that dominated the Socratic Age, explain the main philosophical preoccupations or focus of the ancient age, explain the differences between the pre-Socratic and the Socratic era, explain the achievements of philosophy in the ancient age, demonstrate philosophical skills in analyzing ancient age philosophy. 3.0. Main content. The history of philosophy can be classified into the following. 1. Ancient age, which include pre-Socratic, Socratic, or classical philosophy, and some other ancient philosophical schools. 2. Medieval age. 3. Modern age, age of enlightenment and age of reason. 4. Late modern age. 5. Contemporary philosophy. But in this unit you will be examining the ancient age of philosophy. 3.1. The ancient age. As stated earlier, each of the above classifications represent an age of development in philosophy. In other words, we can say that growth or development of philosophy is from ancient age to the contemporary age. Growing through these ages, philosophy has gone through various stages of transformations of moving from the Dark Age to the Age of Enlightenment and the contemporary time. 3. 1.1. Pre-Socratic. As you are aware, philosophy grew out of wonder and curiosity. What is known as Western philosophy, by which we usually mean everything apart from the Eastern philosophy of China, India, Japan, etc., really began in Greece in about 6th BC. But you need to know that before this period, the Greeks have always been asking questions on issues that concerns man and his existence. They ask questions about reality, cosmos, and other fundamental matters that surrounds human existence. Answers to these questions are always sought through religion and mythology. However, at some point, answers to some of these questions are considered not rational enough, especially by Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes as prominent figures. These group of thinkers were curious to know the ultimate source of things. Thus the question, what is the ultimate source or primary source of all things? This question got different responses from the three philosophers, and they attempt a more rational response to the above question and offer a rational explanation of the universe. 3. 1.2. Thales of Miletus. He is usually considered the first proper philosopher, although he was just as concerned with natural philosophy, what we now call science, as with philosophy as we know it. Perhaps you should note that Thales and most of the other pre-Socratic philosophers, that is, those who lived before Socrates, limited themselves in their discussions to what we can call metaphysics. This is because they were preoccupied with inquiry into the nature of existence, being, and the world. They were referred to as materialists, because they believed that all things are composed of material entity only. Also, they were mainly preoccupied with attempts to identify or establish what reality is without recourse to any kind of supernatural or mythological explanations. That is, they attempt to identify or establish that the world is made up of a single underlying item or substance. This idea is referred to as monism in the latter years of the development of philosophy. According to Thales, he thought the whole universe was composed of different forms of water. In other words, according to Thales, water is the primary source of all things in the universe. It is the original element of which all things were made. Water is the underlying unity in all things. Thales is also said to have predicted an eclipse of the sun, which is believed to have occurred in 585 BC. 3. 1.3. Anaximander. He is the second Greek philosopher, and he was a pupil of Thales. He was also from Miletus in Ionia. Like his master, he held that there must be an original element, a primary stuff of which all things were made. But he did not think it was water as Thales did. According to him, the primary source of all things cannot be any of the things we know, because all the elements we know conflict with each other. If any of them were the original stuff, it would simply conquer and submerge the others. The source of all things must therefore be a neutral element, different from all the elements we know. It must be infinite, boundless, eternal, and indeterminate. You also must know that Anaximander maintained that this world is not the only world that exists. He believed that there are many worlds, and this world of ours is just one of them. He is said to have made the first map ever in history. He is also regarded as the early evolutionist, because he maintained that all living things originated from the sea, and during time developed into various forms by means of adaptations to the environment. He believed that man also evolved from animals, but not the kinds of animals we know. He is known to have maintained that the earth is like a cylinder in shape, a position that differentiates him from those who believed that the world is flat. 1.4. Anaximenes. He is also from Miletus, and he is the third Greek philosopher. Like his predecessors, he also believes that there must be an original stuff from which all things are made, the primary source or underlying source of all things. To him, this is air and not water. Air is the original source and the primary element of all things. Just as our soul being air hold us together, so do breathe and air encompass the whole world. To explain his position, he develops what he called the theory of condensation and refraction. When air rarefies, it becomes light and turns into fire. And when it condenses, it becomes cold, thick, and turn into winds, cloud, water, earth, and finally stones. Both hot and cold, light and thick things. Indeed, all things came from condensation and refraction. Thus, by these processes, all things came from air and will dissolve into air. To Anaximenes, the earth is flat and rests on air. Although these three philosophers came from the same city called Miletus in Ionia, and their philosophical discussion was referred to as the Ionian school of philosophy, however, this school of philosophy came to an end with the destruction of the city of Miletus by the Persian in 494 BC. 3.2. Other philosophers in the Pre-Socratic Age. Another issue the Pre-Socratics wrestled with was the so-called problem of change, how things appear to change from one form to another. Some of the philosophers who engaged themselves in this issue are Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno of Elea, Empedocles, Democritus, and Pythagoras. 2.1. Heraclitus. In seeking for the primary source of all things, like the three Ionians, he thought that the original stuff from which all things were made is fire. However, Heraclitus was more preoccupied with the problem of change in his philosophical enterprise. He believed in an ongoing process of perpetual change, a constant interplay of opposites. Given his belief that everything in the universe undergoes perpetual change, he at a time asserted that nothing is static, everything is in a state of flux. 2.2. Parmenides. Unlike Heraclitus, Parmenides, using a complicated deductive argument, denied that there was any such thing as change at all, and argued that everything that exists is permanent, indestructible, and unchanging. This might sound like an unlikely proposition, but Parmenides' challenge was well argued and was important in encouraging other philosophers to come up with convincing counter-arguments. 2.3. Zeno of Elea. He was a student of Parmenides and is best known for his famous paradoxes of motion, the best known of which is that of the Achilles and the hare. His idea of paradoxes of motion helped to lay the foundations for the study of logic. However, Zeno's underlying intention was really to show, like his master Parmenides and all other before him, that all belief in plurality and change is mistaken, and that motion is nothing but an illusion. Although these ideas might seem to us rather simplistic and unconvincing today, we should bear in mind that, during this time, there was really no scientific knowledge whatsoever. Their attempts were therefore important first steps in the development of philosophical thought. They also set the stage for two other important pre-Socratic philosophers, Empedocles and Democritus. 2.4. Empedocles, Democritus, and Pythagoras. These two, Empedocles and Democritus, combined their ideas into the theory of the four classical elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which became the standard dogma for much of the next 2,000 years. Democritus later developed the extremely influential idea of atomism. This theory simply states that all of reality is composed of tiny, indivisible, and indestructible building blocks known as atoms, which form different combinations and shapes within the surrounding void. Another early and very influential Greek philosopher was Pythagoras, who led a rather bizarre religious sect and essentially believed that all of reality was governed by numbers, and that its essence could be encountered through the study of mathematics. He is known for his claim that with figures the world can be constructed. 3.3. Socratic or Classical Age of Philosophy. 3.1. Socrates. Philosophy really took off, though, with Socrates and Plato in the 5th, 4th century BC, often referred to as the classical or Socratic period of philosophy. Unlike most of the pre-Socratic philosophers before him, Socrates was more concerned with how people should behave, and so was perhaps the first major philosopher of ethics. He developed a system of critical reasoning to work out how to live properly and to tell the difference between right and wrong. His system, sometimes referred to as the Socratic method, was to break problems down into a series of questions, the answers to which would gradually distill a solution. Although he was careful to claim not to have all the answers himself, his constant questioning made him many enemies among the authorities of Athens, who eventually had him put to death. We must point out here that Socrates himself never wrote anything down, and what we know of his views comes from the dialogues of his student Plato, perhaps the best-known, most widely studied, and most influential philosopher of all time. 3.2. Plato. In his writings, Plato was a pupil of Socrates. He blended ethics, metaphysics, the study of reality, political philosophy and epistemology, the theory of knowledge and how we can acquire it, into an interconnected and systematic philosophy. He provided the first real opposition to the materialism of the pre-Socratic, and he developed doctrines such as Platonic realism, essentialism, and idealism, including his important and famous theory of forms and universals. Plato believed that the world we perceive around us is composed of mere representations or instances of the pure ideal forms. The real world to him had their own existence elsewhere. This idea of Plato is known as Platonic realism. He used his theory of world of form to develop and explain his epistemology. He identified the four levels of knowledge, namely imagining, belief, thinking, and perfect intelligence. He also identified the soul as having three parts, namely reason, spirit, and appetite. These three parts of man's soul are related to the three strata or classes in the society. The individual appetites represent the class of workers who satisfy these appetites, the craftsmen or artisans. There is a connection between the spirited element in man and the large-scale version of this force in the military, the guardians or the soldiers. Also, there is a deep connection between the rational element in men and the unique function of leadership in the ruler, the philosopher-king. This tripartite distinction of the soul and the society was used to explain his idea of justice both in the soul and in the state. Thus, to him, there will be justice in the soul if the three parts of the soul functions independently of one another, and there will be justice in the state if each of the parts, that is, the artisan, the soldier, and the ruler, operate without any interference. Plato developed a theory known as eudaimonism. This is the belief that virtue was a kind of knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil, that we need in order to reach the ultimate good, which is the aim of all human desires and actions. Plato's political philosophy was developed mainly in his famous book Republic, where he describes an ideal, though rather grim and anti-democratic, society composed of workers and warriors, ruled over by wise philosopher kings. 3.4. Aristotle. Aristotle was the third in the main trio of classical philosophers. He was Plato's student. He created an even more comprehensive system of philosophy than his master Plato. His philosophical works span across ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, logic, politics, and science, and his work influenced almost all later philosophical thinking, particularly those of the medieval period. Aristotle was engaged in a system of logic called deductive logic, with its emphasis on syllogism. Syllogism is a system of logic where a conclusion, or synthesis, is inferred from two other premises, the thesis and antithesis. This system of logic remained the dominant form of logic until the 19th century. Unlike Plato, Aristotle held that form and matter cannot be separated, and cannot exist apart from each other. Although he too believed in a kind of eudaimonism, Aristotle saw ethics as a very complex concept, and that human beings cannot always control our own moral environment. He believed that happiness could best be achieved by living a balanced life and avoiding excess by pursuing a golden mean in everything. This position is like his formula for political stability through steering a middle course between tyranny and democracy. 3.4. Philosophical movements of the Socratic Age. It should be noted here that in the philosophical history of ancient Greece, there were several other schools or movements that also held sway, in addition to Platonism and Aristotelianism. These movements or schools are Sophism. This group held a relativistic view on knowledge. In other words, they believed that there is no absolute truth, and two points of view can be acceptable at the same time. Generally, they hold skeptical views on truth and morality, although over time, Sophism came to denote a class of intellectuals who taught courses in rhetoric and excellence or virtue for money. Prominent members of this movement are Protagoras and Gorgias. Cynicism. This group rejected all conventional desires for health, wealth, power, and fame, and advocated a life free from all possessions and property as the way to achieving virtue, a life best exemplified by its most famous proponent, Diogenes. Skepticism. This is also known as Pyrrhonism after the movement's founder Pyrrho, which held that because we can never know the true in any substance of things, only how they appear to us, and therefore we can never know which opinions are right or wrong, we should suspend judgment on everything as the only way of achieving inner peace. Epicureanism. This group was named after its founder Epicurus, whose main goal was to attain happiness and tranquility through leading a simple, moderate life, the cultivation of friendships and the limiting of desires, quite contrary to the common perception of the word Epicurean. Hedonism. The hedonists are of the view that pleasure is the most important pursuit of mankind, and that we should always act so as to maximize our own pleasure. Stoicism. This theory was developed by Zeno of Citium and later espoused by Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, which taught self-control and fortitude as a means of overcoming destructive emotions in order to develop clear judgment and inner calm, and the ultimate goal of freedom from suffering. Neoplatonism. This developed out of Plato's work, largely by Plotinus. It was largely a religious philosophy which became a strong influence on early Christianity, especially on St. Augustine, and taught the existence of an ineffable and transcendent one, from which the rest of the universe emanates as a sequence of lesser beings. 4.0. Conclusion. From the above, it is obvious that what started ordinarily as mere idea in the pre-Socratic era has at the time of Aristotle become a discipline of inquiry that borders on human being, his existence, and the nature of the cosmos, with various ideas developed by individual philosophers and movements. 5.0. Summary. To get the best of this unit, you may need to repay it again. Also, drop a comment on the comment section stating the important lesson learned.